We're going to go ahead and get started. There will be a few schools joining us, and they will be trickling in, hopefully from the back side of the room, so that it doesn't disturb your view of the presentations that will be going on. Okay? We're ready to start. Good morning. My name is Sonia Chow, and I am a faculty member here at the School of Architecture and the director of our outreach arm, which is the Center for Urban and Community Design. I take this opportunity on behalf of all of my colleagues and our dean, Rodolphe El-Khoury, to welcome you to the George Perez Architecture Center here at the School of Architecture at the University of Miami's Coral Gable campus on this May 25th, 2016. Before we get started, I'm going to take this opportunity to thank some of the individuals that have been so instrumental in making this event happen. And I should start by thanking our participants in the room for turning off their phones. I do want to thank our partners who approached us and entrusted us to be a part of this with them, and that is, of course, the Southeast Region's Office for the U.S. Department of HUD, which is directed by my colleague, Mr. Jose Cintron, and his staff, who are outside as well. You'll get to meet them in a little bit. We thank you very much for having bestowed that confidence in us, and we have had a wonderful experience working with you, and know that this work will lead to something very useful down the line in Quito, Ecuador. Mr. Cintron will tell you a little bit more about the objectives of this session and where we're headed. But I do want to thank his staff, in particular Gloria Shanahan, Thomasina Brown, and Mr. Bob Cook, for all of their work in making this event happen. They have been so very instrumental and professional along the way. It's been a pleasure to work with them. I also want to thank our funders, those that are making it possible to be here. Our benefactors are, of course, AARP. They're very concerned about resiliency issues, incorporating the needs of all individuals in society, including youth and the elderly. So those are going to be parts of our conversations today as we move forward. I also want to thank my colleagues on a new budding interdisciplinary and interinstitutional collaboration, which we've called Resilient Miami Initiative. My colleagues are here, and I'll introduce them to you in just a little bit, but I really appreciate their spending time to be with us here today to lend their expertise to the thinking process that will be going on. I also want to thank the Office of Miami-Dade County's Office of Resiliency for sending their representative who will be speaking to us shortly. And I want to, in particular, thank all the Miami-Dade County public school teachers that have been a part of this process from the very beginning. You have been great partners with us, and I want to particularly thank Ms. Christina Walker from MAST for her efforts in allowing us to understand what was really entailed in getting all of you here, all the formalities, all the paperwork. So thank you very much for that. We appreciate that very much. So without further ado, I want to finally thank my staff, my colleagues here at the School of Architecture, the directors and staff in the communications area, Annette and Yvonne, as well as our IT department, Robert and Wesley, and at the CUCD, Stacy and Renee Bayo, who have been just great partners. So my thanks to all of you for what you've done, as well as our budget officer, who's made sure that we stay within the financial boundaries that we set for ourselves. So I want to thank all of you for coming here today and spending this half day with us to think about and to envision what resiliency means in the neighborhoods that you are familiar with, which is to say the host neighborhood for your school. This will be an important opportunity for us to have conversations of how you think those communities need to improve, what are the assets already in the community that we could build upon, and how we can strengthen our sense of community and the way that we live today so that we can do so with success, without imposing ourselves on the needs of future generations. So without further ado, I'm going to ask my colleague, Mr. Jose Cintron from the U.S. Office of HUD, to join us for his opening comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chow. So I'm supposed to tell you why we're here. So in case you were wondering, you know, coming down to the University of Miami at 8 o'clock in the morning on a beautiful Wednesday morning, why are you here? First reason you're here is because of you, all of you, frankly. When we engaged with the Board of Ed and engaged with your teachers, we talked about whether they thought it would be worthwhile to have some sessions involving students to talk about everyone's future in this world. And they unanimously and overwhelmingly said, yeah, our students have something to add to this discussion. Our students are indeed ready, willing, able, and worthy of being listened to and engaging in the discussion about our future. And so that we're very excited to have you here and engaged. And we hope to, if you're here because it's a school project, we hope to reel you in even more and engage you and think and have you think about the kinds of activities you can engage in to lead this country forward in a more sensible developmental way than perhaps my generation has brought you to the positions that we're in today. So the United Nations sponsors every 20 years a conference, an international conference to talk about a topic of importance. The first one was 40 years ago. The second one was 20 years ago. Actually, HUD was involved in the one 20 years ago, and I was a part of HUD as well. And that was talking about refugee crises across the world. The conference that's going to be held in Quito, Ecuador in October of 2016 is to talk about building resilient communities and creating resilient communities, particularly in the urban core. It is estimated that by the year 2050, 70% of the world will live in cities. 70% of the world will live in cities. Many of you live in cities in South Florida. You know how challenging that can be. So the idea is to talk about how can we create living environments, how can we create urban cities across the world that are resilient in nature. I love the word resilient. It's not sustaining, it's not surviving, it's being resilient. To me, resilient means being able to be knocked down by a hurricane, stand back up, and continue to thrive. So we're talking about resiliency in the terms of being able to have thriving communities going forward, to have figured out the answer to how we're going to deal with climate change, how we're going to deal with sea rise, how are we going to deal with an aging community that refuses to die, like me. You know, old people that refuse to die. I expect to be around in 2050. I'll be 97. But you will have figured out how to take care of me wherever I live. And it is important because I'm not going to be engaged the way I am today in community development activities and neighborhood development activities, but many of you will be. And many of you will be able to chart the course for us. So the best time to start listening to your ideas is today. There's no better time to start than today. 45 years ago, I graduated from high school. When I graduated from high school 45 years ago, I had an idea of what I wanted to do because I had already served as a youth member of the board of directors of a housing development corporation in East Harlem, New York. That's where I was born and raised. As a public housing resident in East Harlem, I knew that I wanted to be involved in making our neighborhoods better. We could do better than that. And when we talk about building resilient neighborhoods and resilient communities, that's where you have a blank slate, really, except for what we've already messed up on the way to today. So we want you to be engaged in these discussions. You're going to have a great time today. Your teachers say you're ready, willing, able, and worthy, and so I take them at their word. I know you will be engaged, but what we also want you to do is to have fun. We also want you to be unafraid to state a position that you have. We want you to be willing to listen to others as they state positions that they have and that they hold. Because we have a lot of smart people in the room. The only way you get smarter is to listen to other people who are also smart people. If you only listen to your own thoughts, you're never going to get smarter. So we are asking you to help us get smarter, help your peers get smarter, help your teachers get smarter. By the way, I mentioned your teachers. Before we do anything, I would like you all to give your teachers a round of applause for believing in you, for vouching for you, and for working many, many hours beyond their normal school day to plan this event on your behalf. So I welcome you, I welcome your ideas, I welcome your engagement, I welcome your questions, I welcome your statements. Just have fun and get into it, because as Dr. Chow will explain to you now, we have a full morning and quick lunch experience planned for you, but most of it includes your engagement and your involvement. So without further ado, Dr. Chow will explain where we go from here. Thank you.
So we've thought it would be appropriate to start this mini charrette with 3 very short kind of presentations. Think of TEDx format presentations. And that way you're going to be bombarded with a lot of information in very short amount of time. We are encouraging you to take notes throughout all of the presentations, because you'll find that there are going to be things that are going to be presented to you that would be very helpful in your thinking process that will follow this. So we're going to flip the schedule just a second, because we have with us this morning Ms. Catherine Hageman from the Miami-Dade County Office of Resiliency. She's the sustainability officer in that, coordinator in that office. And she's been a great partner of the School of Architecture for a while now, working with us and trying to take messages to different high schools about resiliency that we hope to grow further. Her office has just been established in the past year, and it's already off to an incredible start. And we thought it would be a great opportunity for all of you to learn firsthand how our local government is leading us in our objectives to reach resilient designs for our communities. So the first presentation, I'm going to ask you to welcome Ms. Katie Hageman to the podium. Thank you.
Hey guys, thank you so much again for having me here this morning. It's, as people mentioned, I work at the Office of Resilience for Miami-Dade County, so that means our office covers the entire county, including all the municipalities within it, the city of Miami, for example, and others. So our office is relatively new. Before our office was the Office of Resiliency, we were named the Office of Sustainability. And as part of that sustainability focus, we created Greenprint, which is a sustainability plan for the county, and that focuses on environmental initiatives, energy efficiency, water efficiency, healthy communities, land use, and transportation to encourage smart growth, and also it includes our climate action plan. So as we transition to the Office of Resilience, a lot of this sustainability work is going to move forward with us as well. That's still part of what we're focusing on resilience. But I think it'd be helpful, as mentioned before, that we've switched our name to be the Office of Resilience. And I want to just talk a little bit about why. So I'm sure you all are familiar with some of the events that have happened, some recently and some not so recently. So when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, I think it was a big wake-up call for many people. I had a good friend from New Orleans and watched her go through it. And as we looked at the response to Katrina, which is obviously an extreme example, there are a lot of lessons that people learned from that experience about how we could better prepare and be ready to bounce forward after these events, because a lot of people suffered and lost their lives through these events. More recently, Hurricane Sandy hit the New York, New Jersey region, and some of those same lessons came up again. These were areas that were vulnerable. They were in the coastal areas, in the floodplains, and when the storm hit, a lot of damage resulted. Fortunately, people were generally safer. But after those events, people started to ask, how can we not just rebuild after there's a storm? How can we use these opportunities to think more intelligently about how we design our communities and how we prepare for those events? So that's how the term resilience started to gain currency. It's this idea that we know every community has these shocks and stressors. So if you're in India, you might be worried about chronic power outages. If you're in Haiti, you might be worried about earthquakes. If you're in San Francisco, you might be worried about tsunamis or earthquakes. In certain communities, you might just be more worried about public safety. So every community has these stresses or shocks. The idea is to understand the environment and understand what those shocks are and what those stressors are, and how can you prepare for them and use those as opportunities to continue to make a better community. You know, that we have some examples like the Chicago fire of sometimes those tragic events can hopefully provide more opportunities to rethink how you want to live in your neighborhood or in your community. So I just want to quickly announce that, sorry for the screenshot, but later this morning, we're going to become part of what's called the 100 Resilient Cities Initiative. So this is 100 global cities, really different. You can see we have Pune, India, Quito, Ramallah in Palestine, Porto Alegre in Brazil. All of these places, there are many US cities as well, have different shocks and stressors, but still there's a similarity between cities. And so by creating this network where we can all work together, we can think through these challenges together and think about how we can make Miami more resilient. So in our application to become part of this program, we listed a bunch of shocks and stressors. So obviously the shock that comes to mind first is hurricanes, right? But we also have other chronic stressors in Miami, like the inequality and the disparity between different neighborhoods. That's also a chronic stress that sort of weakens our ability to bounce back after a storm. We know certain communities are going to have a harder time bouncing back, so how can we know that and help everyone prepare and create stronger communities? I just wanted to talk quickly about one of the biggest stresses for the community, which is sea level rise. So hopefully this is old news, but just in case it's not, I'll just go through some of the causes and consequences. So the sea is rising because we have a very thin atmosphere, and because of all of the human activity of releasing greenhouse gases and altering the surface of the earth with deforestation and urbanization, we've changed the composition of the atmosphere and how the earth responds. So we're warming our atmosphere. And that's causing our sea levels to rise. We have really long records here, going back to 1910 in Key West, where we can see this long-term trend, and it's ticking up at about 2.3 millimeters a year. But we can also see in the short time. So this is a graph from last October. The blue box represents what we typically see as low tide and high tide. And the blue line is what we expected to see throughout the day, as there's high tide and low tide, high tide and low tide. But the red line was what we actually saw, almost a foot higher in some cases than what we predicted. And that's due to some of those longer term changes with the ocean warming. But also at that moment was because we have all of these changes are affecting ocean currents as well. And here in Florida, the sea level rise is affected by the strength of the Gulf Stream. And last October, the strength of the Gulf Stream slowed down. And that might just be a trend, or might just be a periodic trend, or that might be a longer term change that we should adapt to. But nevertheless, there are a lot of reasons why the sea level is at different points at different, every minute of the day. But we know these long-term trends are very important. So some of the reasons why we've seen sea level rise in the past aren't necessarily going to be the most important in the future. So the most important in the future is going to be the land-based ice sheets in Greenland and West Antarctica. And I say they're most important because on a human timescale, during the time that I'm alive and you're alive, we're not going to be able to reverse any melting that we have on those ice sheets. It's very important that we be as conservative as possible and try and prevent the melting or slow that melting as much as possible. So this is a little animation showing how in Greenland, we're losing mass or ice from the actual ice sheet, and that's entering the oceans. So the red areas are where we're seeing the loss of mass or the loss of ice. And obviously, the darker the red, the more mass you're losing. And you can see it's mostly on the edge and mostly on the southern side as well. This is a trend you're looking on the left from 2004 to 2014. So we have a 10-year record here for this animation, and you can see how those changes are coming about. And it's affecting almost the entire ice sheet. Just if you're curious, this is by measuring the gravity, which other people can talk about if you're interested. So the other major area that's important for South Florida is the West Antarctic ice sheet. You can think of Antarctica in two parts, the eastern side, which is hopefully more stable because it has a lot of high mountains that help trap the ice, and then the western side, which is lower and more vulnerable to melting. So what you can see here in this animation is how the ice sheets, or the ice, is sliding towards the sea, where there are darker colors, that speed is faster. So what that looks like on the edge of the ice margin, you can see here, there will be these intermittent breakups. Sometimes it's very slow and seasonal, and then sometimes you have these, what you would think of as nonlinear or relatively quick changes right at the edge. And a lot of those changes, hopefully this will play. There's sound as well, but I'll just narrate through it. A lot of these changes are speeding up now because we have warmer ocean temperatures. So the warmer ocean temperatures are coming into contact with these ice sheets, and as they break up on the edge, that means that everything that's behind them can move more quickly to the sea. So it starts a chain reaction throughout the part of the ice sheet that's connected. So not the whole ice sheet, but just the part that's connected. So there are certain places where we know these dynamics are more important, and you can see here in the red some of the areas of West Antarctica that are most concerning. Let's try and skip these. So the big picture, though, is that right now we have warmer atmosphere and warmer oceans because of human activity and natural cycles, but the ice sheets haven't caught up to those warmer temperatures. Kind of like when you take ice out of the glass, out of the freezer and put it on the counter, it doesn't all melt right away. It takes a while for it to reach equilibrium, and that's the state that we're in right now. Ice sheet isn't really in balance with the temperature of the air and the water, and it's adjusting. So the amount that we'll see in the future depends a lot on how much we emit and also how quickly the ice responds, which is an unknown. So we have estimates that we use here locally to project how much we'll see in the future. So the high-end estimate is by 2030 to see about a foot, and by 2060 to see 34 inches. Or what you could also look at this blue area as if you were looking for a more conservative estimate. So you might think 3 millimeters a year, what's the big deal? It doesn't sound that scary. But one of the things is that the shoreline responds differently. If it's a hard edge, if it's just a wall, the water will just move up. But if it's a soft shoreline, it can move sideways quite a bit in a process of erosion. And you can see that on the beaches here. So up here we have part of the beach where you can see it's where people are living. They've managed the beach to try and hold it in place. But naturally, the ocean and the barrier island would be in equilibrium, and the barrier island would migrate in response to the higher sea levels. And the same thing is true with mangroves. Just a slight change in the water level, and those could move quite a bit. So I'll try and speed up here, but generally speaking, we're not just thinking about the coastal areas in Miami. The shape of Miami, we have high points on the barrier islands near the dunes. We have high points on the ridge, like where we are now, and then it goes lower as you go closer to the Everglades. So as that water level rises, there's also a risk of flooding in the inland areas. And you can see that sort of pile up when it rains. So our system of pumping and managing water used to rely on gravity. It used to just flow from the inland down to the ocean. But as the ocean level rises, that gravity system doesn't work as well, and we have to transition to a system of pumping. We also have to look out for, as sea level rises, how that will affect our aquifer. So because the ground that we're standing on is very porous, the water between the ocean and the mainland can move very easily. And so as the salt water moves inland, that can also affect our drinking water. And so that's a vulnerability we have to look out for. So the other challenge, which is why we have a room full of you guys together to help, is that here, because the ground is so porous and the water moves so easily, we can't build walls like they have in New Orleans or like they have in the Netherlands, because the water will just bubble up from underneath. So we have to be more creative and think about how can we adapt or respond without using walls. So these are some examples of other places. We can't stop the sea from rising, but there are lots of ways that we can think about responding. This is an example from New York, where they created a breakwater to help protect them from the storm. So when the storm comes, the wave energy is less, and it doesn't cause as much damage. But they designed it in a way so that the crevices and that the shape of the structure was best for fish habitat and creating other habitat, so they could also improve the water quality and the environmental quality. Another idea out of the Netherlands is a concept that they call building with nature. So instead of using fixed structures or rigid structures, they're trying to think about how to use nature, which has a living quality, to respond and adapt. So in this particular example, they created an artificial island, which they called a sand engine, which over time breaks down and you can see is carried by the currents, but it helps protect their beaches and the communities that are downstream. Another example is managing the water that's in our cities in a better way so that we can capture and hold some of that water. Right now, in a lot of the urban areas, when it rains, it hits a hard surface like a parking lot or a road, moves quickly, picking up the pollutants on the surface into a pipe and then into the bay or into a well. So there are ways that we can use what we call green infrastructure to manage that water in a better way that creates better water quality and a more pleasant urban environment. So these are some examples, concepts for the city of Boston of using absorbent streets, floodable parks, or underground storage. This is from New Orleans, where they're trying to think about how can we use these canals that we have all over the city in the way that we do, also as green spaces of linear parks where you can have bike paths or running paths or other ways to connect the cities, and also to connect different neighborhoods that might not necessarily interact as much, so that living with water is an amenity rather than just a utilitarian thing that we try and keep to the side. And they have multiple purposes, right? So when it rains, they can catch the water, but when there's dry weather, they can also be a park space. This is another example. You can see there are tall walls on the edge here, so that as the river floods, it'll keep that water within the catch basin, but when the water level is low, people can use that as a park space where they can walk and cut through the center of the city. I think this river also used to be underground, and they actually excavated it, so to speak, and made it visible. This is another example of green infrastructure from Portland, where they use the spaces in their sidewalk. They cut little holes, and they grow these small rain gardens, which help catch the runoff from the street, but also improve the environment and the shade as well. This is a project that I worked on in Bridgeport. Bridgeport is a city kind of like Detroit in Connecticut, where a lot of the development happened, like it did here, on places that used to be wetlands. So they took the wetlands, they added extra soil, and then they built the city on top of it. And those areas where they filled in the wetlands have a lot of flooding issues. They're vulnerable to hurricanes, they get really soggy every time it rains. So this was a project about funded by HUD actually, thank you, about how to excavate some of that water and make it more of a pleasant urban environment, but also less vulnerable. So the green areas are places where that connection to water we tried to restore and enhance. This is another view of it, about how to connect that downtown area with the more vulnerable south end. And you can see some of this, what's a rendering, it's just a concept, it's not an actual project, but the idea was also to use living shorelines just offshore to help protect the beach and the buffering park. So another example from Rotterdam, they call it the sculpture park, I think. You can see there are different sculptures across this river. So this is what it looks like when it rains, but when it's dry, there's a promenade that you can walk along, and it's part of the city. So it has multiple purposes, not just to manage the flooding. And then for Florida, the most important defense against storms is the mangroves. They've evolved to be very protective, and it's very important to think about where the mangroves are and how we can protect them, because as I mentioned, as the sea level rises, they don't necessarily, they may need help to respond and to keep up with that sea level rise if they're already stressed. If they're healthy, they can likely adapt and keep up, but if they're stressed or if there isn't enough sediment or if there are other stressors, they may not be able to keep up with sea level rise. So my last point is that there are great tools online. This one's called the Coastal Flood Exposuremapper, and you can go online and look up your address and see what are the hazards for your area, because obviously sea level rise is one, but storm surge and flooding from rain events is also another. So you can go online and see all these different hazards and see what your area is vulnerable to. So one of the projects that we're starting in our office is looking at some of these most vulnerable areas and thinking through how can they respond and adapt. So one of the first areas that we're looking at, which I should have a picture of, but I don't, is up in North Miami in like the Arch Creek area around Johnson and Wales and FIU Biscayne campus. So if anyone is from that area and wants to get involved, you can reach out. We have a lot of projects going on through our office, mostly on policy, but if anyone wants to be involved in helping us think through these solutions, we're all ears and would love to have your help. So Professor Chow has our contact details, and if anyone wants to get involved or pitch their idea, we would love to hear it. So thank you guys so much, and these are my contact details.
I'm going to sort of recap really quickly some of the things that we've been talking about so far. And thank you. And I'm going to move us forward and talk a little bit more about how we can start to think about our own neighborhoods, think about resilient cities and buildings that are going to include all of us as part of that conversation and those considerations. So far we've heard about how we as humans have had an impact on climate, right? And how our human activities have gotten us into this mess. We've learned that we've accelerated the amount of greenhouse gases that are being emitted into the air. And we've heard about how our cities are largely responsible for that, right? So we know that a great percentage of those greenhouse gas emissions, as you can see, approximately 78% of them are in fact coming from our cities, even though cities right now are only about 2% of the land mass that we have on the planet Earth. But right now we're at 50%, but as you heard before, populations within cities are going to continue to expand in the very near future. So as we all know, every time that we do something, there's a consequence for it. And here in South Florida, that means that we're going to have to be dealing with climate changes and challenges in an increasing manner, right? Some of our communities are already, in fact, having to grapple with some of these challenges. But we know that this means that for all of us, there will be increased number of extreme weather events, such as hurricanes, but it also will mean that we'll have extreme rain events that will cause floodings, for example, in a more frequent manner. There will be more heat wave events, and we'll even have more wildfire events in our inland areas. We also know that there are going to be increasing ocean temperatures, as we've already heard, that will result in higher sea level. Sea level rise, of course, is really important to South Florida because, as you've heard, we're very low-lying, and we're also challenged by the very porous limestone base that we're sitting on, and that will mean that we'll have to deal with something called hydrostatic pressure. That, combined with the fact that much of our aquifer in some areas is very shallow, it means that some of our neighborhoods are going to be challenged with dry day flooding. And so we have all of these consequences that are kind of converging upon us, and we need to figure out how to become more resilient and deal with them. Now, if you don't think that this impacts your life, I'm just going to go through a couple of quick slides for you, and I'm going to show you. This is Miami's Brickell downtown area, the port area along the Miami River, but this is what that area would look like with only 1 meter of sea level rise. Now think about it. That's our business engine for all of Miami-Dade County, right? One of the main industrial ports in all of the state of Florida. What about our tourism engine, right? A lot of us have perhaps family that are working in hotels or restaurants or other industries related to hospitality, and Miami Beach, Barrier Island, not too different from Key Biscayne, right? Well, this is what it would look like with 1 meter of sea level rise. So there would go our tourism engine. So now we have no tourism engine, no economic engine, and we're already starting to deal with these consequences today, so we know that it's only going to get worse on us. But here's some of your neighborhoods. And you can see how even your neighborhoods, which may be further inland, are also going to be impacted by sea level rise in the very short term. So 2 examples here, a couple of examples here: Hialeah, Coral Gardens, Richmond Heights, Allapattah, Key Biscayne. And we haven't really talked about storm surges, right? Storm surges are those large waves of water created by the energy of hurricanes. And as sea level rise continues to increase, that storm surge, as you can see in the slide behind me, will also increase. So those that are further inland, who have always thought of themselves as being, well, I'm sort of far away from the coast, I don't really have to worry about this, not my problem. Well, guess what? You're not only dealing with hydrostatic pressure, you're not only dealing with coastal sea level rise, but you're also going to be dealing with storm surge activities that you probably didn't think about beforehand. And so a much greater part of our population will in fact be impacted. And this is what we could look like if we got a Cat 5 hurricane accompanied with storm surge. All of a sudden, as my colleague Hal Wanless says, we start to look a lot like the Florida Keys. Now, we can continue to think that this is not our problem. I don't need to deal with it. My family doesn't need to deal with this. Someone else is going to do that for me. Some scientist in some far out location in some lab is going to come up with a magical bullet, and he's going to fix this problem for all of us so that we can continue to live our lives the way we do today. Well, guess what? If we stayed on that, this is where we're headed. Now, I don't know about you, but it looks to me like my home is no longer around. Is yours? So it means that we actually do have to think about taking personal responsibility and about being part of the conversation today. If we haven't already been a part of the conversation, then we should become part of that conversation today. Each and every one of you sitting in this room can decide to either sit back, do nothing, or you can become a leader that drives positive change in your communities. It's your choice. It's your planet. So what do we have at our disposal to do that? We have a couple of words that I want you all to be feeling really comfortable with: adaptation, mitigation, and resiliency. And what do those mean to you and to your families and to your communities? Adaptation are a series of strategies that are dealing with consequences that we're going to have to tackle in the near term. Mitigation strategies, on the other hand, are things that are going to help us try to become more responsible citizens and to try to take care of the planet in a more responsible manner than, as Mr. Cintron said, we have done thus far. So mitigation might have to do with things such as thinking about creating more transportation alternatives, to thinking about how we conserve energy, whereas adaptation might have to do with, well, how do we change our land use codes? How do we adapt our buildings so that they can survive and be resilient? So for South Florida, sustainability and mitigation are very related terms that are dealing with the long term, as I just said. Adaptation is going to focus on managing the impacts of climate change. Resiliency, lots of different variable definitions for it. It's in fact a term that we have decided to use, but it actually has been used for a very long time in the world of ecology, as we've observed how the natural world becomes resilient and adapts itself. But essentially, it means that we have the capacity to tolerate and to overcome, right? The damages, and perhaps then we can also not only overcome them, but we can be more productive afterwards. But climate change adaptation also means that we have to be conscious of the types of decisions that we're going to have at our disposal to make and what those adjustments could be. We have to respond to actual as well as expected climate stimuli and to understand their effects and be very practical about it. You're asking yourself, well, why are we having this conversation about climate and how does that relate to the economy? Well, here's the reason why we're sitting here today at a School of Architecture to have this conversation. Truth be told, architects and planners have been a big part of the problem of creating the types of places that we live in today that have contributed or accelerated climate change. And you're asking yourself, well, why is that? I thought the problem were cars. Well, the problem is that we've been designing cities since approximately the end of the Second World War, which is really when it took off. And those cities, as you can see in the highlighted area, have resulted in unchecked, subsidized suburban expansions and urban disinvestment, right? And those have resulted in very expensive and inequitable and damaging growth patterns. And it turns out that that has made us more susceptible today to shocks that we may have to deal with in the future or to disruptions because of the disconnectedness of the way that we've created cities. And I'm going to talk to you just a little bit more about that in a minute. So the concept of resiliency conveys the ability to not only effectively bounce back from such changes and shocks, but to ideally bounce forward, right? So that means that requires that we look at a variety of different topics at the same time, and that's what I want you guys to do today. That's what we all want you to do today. We want you to think about things such as economic development. Do we have enough businesses in my community? Do we have enough housing types? What are the patterns of those housing types? Can grandma live in my neighborhood, or do I have to drive 10 miles to get to her, right? Do we have transportation options, or are those limited? Do we have infrastructure that enriches our social and our economic and geographic networks? These are the reasons why we're here to talk about these things today. So we've heard about all of the things that we're going to that are negatively happening in our climate and how we're going to have to tackle them. But are we balancing our reaction to that? Have we started to really think about, well, I have all these problems that are on board, happening or about to happen. Am I thinking about how I'm going to counter that and how I'm going to react to that? We should be. It's a real balancing act, though. So many things that are involved, right? It can be very complex and seem very messy and almost chaotic. And in fact, to some degree, it can be if you don't stay focused. But first and foremost, at the foundation of all of our conversations should be the politics. At the foundation of our conversations should be the science. The science is what should drive our choices, right? Not the lobbyists with special interests, right? Not the politicians who want the vote again. But we should be thinking about social equity. We should be thinking about economic development that is fair for all, and that includes all of us as a part of the solution making. We should be thinking about things like health and education as a part of this. And are we communicating effectively so that everyone has the opportunity to really understand how they and their families are going to be impacted by climate change? So we're literally at a crossroads right now. You've heard about the Paris summit that took place in December and some of their goals. And at this point in time, we can either choose to do nothing and head towards what will probably get us to over 4 degrees difference. And our planet would be unrecognizable to us. Or we can have other strategies. And as you can see from that drawing up there, unless we really start to be more aggressive, we're not going to get to where we need to go in the time that we need to get there, which is, by the way, sooner than you think. And so we're going to end up with a planet that is no longer as hospitable as it's been so far. So we really have two ways to go, and we have to understand that we've already used up a lot of what we had as resources, and now we have to think differently about them. But we also have to think very clearly about who are those members of our society that are most at risk. Are we thinking about them? So are you thinking about your sister or your brother? How about your grandmother or your grandfather? Are you guys thinking about them? Because they're part of this conversation. And if you're going to be the leaders of this conversation in the future, then you should be thinking about them as well as you do your planning. So what are some of the leading stressors? I'm going to walk you through them. And this part of the presentation is meant to make you think about the things you should be talking about in that room next to us in just a few minutes. So we know we've disregarded the fragile resources such as the Everglades. We know we've made costly mistakes. We know that we have wasteful practices. We know all those things. And we know that, in fact, they've resulted in our compromising our natural resources as well as had negative impacts, whether it be our economy or our health. We know that one of the biggest reasons that we're in this boat is because of the amount of time we spend behind a wheel driving cars. Now, yes, we've made cars much more efficient, but as you can see from these numbers that we have from the EPA and the IPCC and DOT, there are over 200 million cars on the road each day, and 60,000 miles are being driven every second. And that results in over 60,000 pounds of carbon emission every second. So why are we in that car? Well, we're going to talk about that in just a second. But some of the other things that are contributing towards these problems have to do with how much energy we're consuming, whether it's to air condition our house or to keep the food in our refrigerator colder, or how many times we decide to launder our clothes. It also has to do with how much waste we're producing. In the last 30 years alone, we've almost doubled the amount of waste that we're producing and that we're placing into our planet. And about 15% of that is toxic. We also know that we're not managing our water resources well, and that in fact the planet is already going under a process called desertification, which means that by the year 2025, approximately 50% of the world's population will suffer from the scarcity of potable water. And who's to say that that won't include us, right? So why are we talking about architecture and urbanism? The diagram in the back is going to give you a clue. Here's a pizza pie, right? Everyone's had a good slice of pizza. Well, what makes that pizza so wonderful? Well, it's got a nice form, nice attractive form that we like. It's easy to manage, it's easy to handle. But we like the fact that we can have it with the sauce, the anchovies or the artichokes or the vegetables or the cheese, right? The cheese kind of is the glue that puts it all together. And we like that we can have part of that in each one of the bites. Well, that's kind of how we used to create communities. We used to create communities that were whole, that had an identifiable kind of identity to them, right? And we used to have a clear sense of where our government leaders were because there was a main street, there were town hall buildings, there were places where we knew that we could engage others in civic spaces. And we knew that there was a sprinkling of mixes of uses and people throughout our community, so they were walkable. But now, since the advent of zoning, we started to divvy everything up. We divided everything up. So it's no longer really a pizza, any more than it's really a community when we start to do that, right? It just becomes a series of fractured pieces that are put together. So we can decide to do the same things that we've been doing for the past 60 or so years, And we can continue to have a negative impact on our natural resources by continuing these bloated, disconnected ways of creating suburbia that then make us car dependent. Or we can stop for a moment and think about what it means to really be a community. So rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? Because that's why we came up with zoning, by the way. We thought, well, we don't like industries near us, so we have to kind of segregate everything so those nasty industries are away. Well, it didn't occur to us to maybe just get rid of the one thing that was a problem. We decided to use the same process for everything. So that's why we wound up like the diagram that you see on the bottom, where I need to get into my car to drive to go get a carton of milk, or I have to drive to go to school, or I have to drive to go to the movie theater, or I have to drive to go meet with a friend, because God knows I can't walk there. Much of suburbia is completely disconnected. So what happens is that we've become a lot like a zoo, right? Think about the last time you were at the zoo. You arrived and there was this one big main artery that everyone walked on, right? Think of that as the highway that connects us all, right? Think about how jam-packed that was on a special holiday weekend in particular. And so you kind of got off that main highway and you walked over and you saw the lions for a while. You got back on that main highway, went up a little bit farther, and then you went over and you visited the monkeys. You say, oh, that's great. Okay, and then I'm going back, and I skipped these because I don't like those. And I skipped those because I don't like those either. And then I kept going, and I arrived at the birds because they're great. Love them. Stayed there with a while. Came back onto my main road, and that's how I visited these animals in a setting that is in fact completely artificial. And that's why they're all depressed, by the way, in those zoos, because they're not in their natural environment any more than we are when we're in communities that are completely disconnected from each other. In fact, society has greater issues related to mental health today, in part because we've forgotten how to relate to each other. We're always in our car, perhaps with our iPod or a phone next to us, God forbid, and we're not really talking to anyone. We don't know anyone other than the people that are essential to our activities. So we've lost this kind of notion of civility and of interaction. And that's why we are weaker as communities, because we've lost the capacity to engage. So we can think to do the same thing as the very wise Forrest Gump in his movie said, stupid is as stupid does. And we can continue to do the same things, or we can continue to learn from the past and rethink how we make places. So we can create places that are whole, that have mixes of uses, which include parks and civic monuments and structures that are either religious or civic, and different types of housing and places where we can work, and I can walk there if I choose to, or I can use a metro line to get there, or a bus, or a bike. Or I could be in this other environment. How pleasant is that, sitting in the highway, baking in the sun, waiting in traffic to get from building number 1 over to the black building in the background. And notice the wonderful smog sitting over the city that's either farther beyond. So everything is disconnected. So we can keep making these places, and these places, in fact, create social inequities, because not everyone can afford that car, right? Not everyone can afford the time that it takes to get from point A to point B, right? The gasoline, the vehicle itself. Public transportation, is it viable? Is it a good alternative? Does it really work? So we have to start thinking about what are the barriers that are not allowing us as a society to thrive, much less be resilient. So to really create a resilient community, we have to think of ourselves as these neighborhoods that are completely self-sufficient. Now, you all are too young to know about Hurricane Andrew, but the older folks in this room that lived in South Florida, they remember what Hurricane Andrew meant. They lived through it. We remember how it changed our sense of place, how it impacted our economies, and how neighborhoods were solely reliant on that which they could walk to, right? So let's think about resiliency as thinking about communities and neighborhoods as being whole. And that's what we want you to think about. What are the missing pieces in your neighborhood that are needed to make your community whole? Are we living by the principles of creating transportation choices for everyone, affordable housing for everyone, economic development opportunities for everyone? Are we trying to support our existing communities? And are we really valuing our communities, our historic buildings, and the people that live in these places? So to be really resilient, these are the things you're going to want to tackle. You're going to want to make sure your community is walkable. If it's not walkable, why isn't it walkable? What do I have to do to make that community more walkable? Is it because I don't have enough mixes of land uses? Is it interesting for people to walk? Is there a tree for me to have some shade as I'm trying to get from point A to point B? Are there transportation options? You're going to want to think about everything from making your house storm ready to making sure that your community can survive and become even stronger if there is an extreme weather event. And we've learned from Hurricane Andrew that, in fact, those communities that were most resilient at the time were not rich or poor, but rather they knew where to go get help. People that were living in Florida City, in Homestead, those folks knew exactly where Main Street was. They knew that FEMA was going to arrive in those locations, and they got their help first than some of the folks that were living in some of the unincorporated areas that didn't know where to go, right? So creating a new heart to our community is important, right? Because through that process, we'll not only create civic identity, but we might even create larger economic opportunities. So we're going to really focus on creating walkable neighborhoods that have all the types of amenities that are needed to allow us to be more self-sufficient. I want you to look at the two diagrams on the right-hand side. These are a 5-minute walk in a suburban sprawling neighborhood versus a neighborhood of interconnected streets. And you can see how quickly that pedestrian shed expanded on you just by the simple design of those streets. So some of you are going to tackle suburban problems. And you're going to say, well, how do I create more diversity? Well, I might change the single-family house and suggest that it could have other uses. Small businesses, mom and pop shops. Could it have a granny flat on top of it? How do I create changes in the housing type that already exists? How do I change businesses along a street that pretends to be commercial but really is just an ocean of parking with a building set back somewhere far back from the so-called pedestrian street? So think about how we also include things such as urban agriculture, right? So that the areas that we have in our neighborhoods stop being about cars and start being more about people and places for people. We also want to start thinking about how we regenerate our natural systems and use them to our benefit. So those of you that are going to be dealing with coastal areas in particular want to pay attention to this slide, because we know that those coastal systems that we've already heard about are going to increase our capacity to not only have food readily available, but we will have a natural resource that will help to protect us. Not from everything, they are not another magic bullet, but they are one of those elements that can contribute to making us more resilient. So you may think about different ways in which you can impact that coastal shore in your community, right? This might really impact those of you that are looking at coastal resilience. But what we should all be thinking about is how we create more urban forests. And the reasons for that are clear. A, they create places that are shaded, cooler, more pedestrian activity means you can have more thriving businesses along the street, more places for people to congregate and be together in. But it also helps to improve our air quality, and it helps us with collecting some of that extra stormwater as well. So we're really focused on resilient neighborhoods for everyone, right? And creating places for everyone in our society. And the buildings, well, we're not going to spend too much time on them, but I want you to go away with this thought, that the way that we design buildings really matters. And that is because 48% of the energy that's being consumed is actually going to feed our buildings. So that's why an interesting term, if you've never heard about it, write it down and research it when you get back to your schools, called net zero homes. You and your families should be looking at that as a possibility to make your own families a bit more resilient. And learning from the past, well, we want to do that as well, because guess what? Before we had air conditioners in South Florida, people knew how to build a building for South Florida. They knew how to put porches on them. They knew how to lift them off the ground in case there was any flooding. They knew how to build a building that could allow us to live here comfortably. And lastly, I want to remind you that you have historic buildings, those connections that we have with our past, the heritage of our communities. Don't leave those behind. Think of those as well. Value those. And understand that those need to be part of your considerations as well. So hopefully, by the end of the day, we've had an opportunity to think about what are some of the most vulnerable items or aspects of our communities. We've tried to tackle them. We've tried to be sympathetic to the image of our city while we're being very realistic about who we are and how we're moving forward in this conversation called resiliency. 3 important words we have to remember when it comes to resiliency. We're going to try to protect, right? But we may sometimes have to retreat as well, okay? And retrofitting is somewhere in between there. So some communities are going to have to say, maybe this isn't a long-term kind of place. But what can I do to make it livable and thriving in the short term, right? So we need to be very, very responsible as we continue to have these conversations with others so that we know what the reality is and that we plan accordingly for it, okay? I leave you with this one last thought. Remember that if everyone on the globe lived the way that we do as Americans, it would take 5 planet Earths to sustain all of them. Some of our politicians are very concerned with what's happening in India and what they're doing in China, and it's all their fault and it's all their problems. God forbid these individuals that are in, growing economies should try to be anything like us. Well, shouldn't we lead by example? Shouldn't we kind of start to say maybe we're doing things that need to be adjusted so that others follow us, right? So what we need to do is simply understand that what we're doing is really unsustainable. Take personal responsibility for it. I leave this one last thought. We may not know everything. I love the question everyone's always asking me. So sea level rise, when's it going to happen? No one knows that answer. No one knows that answer because, as you heard from Katie's presentation, the rate at which some of these activities are happening in the Arctic regions, we can't necessarily measure them with such precision. We could tell you in 2 years' time, we will have exactly 2 feet of sea level rise. We can't tell you that. It could be in a year, or it could be in 5 or 10 years. But we do know enough science to know that we've already bought into, whether we like it or not, given all our bad behavior up until now, we've already bought into a certain amount of climate change. We know that. So we have the responsibility of preparing for that, okay? And that's what we're here to do today. So please, the conversations start here today, but continue them at home with your friends at schools and with your local leaders so that together we can all prepare, all right? Last thought, Machiavelli. He said, there is nothing more difficult nor more doubtful of success nor more dangerous to handle than to initiate a new order of things. And yet, that's exactly what we need today, right? So guess what? Each one of you control climate change. Be part of the solution. So today, how are we going to move forward? Well, first and foremost, I'm going to introduce to you very quickly my colleagues from the Resilient Miami Initiative that are here with me today. I thank them from the bottom of my heart for their generosity of spending time with us. From the School of Geology, we have Professor Hal Wanless. From the School of Engineering, we have Professor Landolph Rhodes Barbarigos. From the Department of Geology, we have Shivangi Prasad. There she is. From FAU, my colleague Colin Polsky could not be here with us today, but he has sent two wonderful representatives in Miss Serena Hoerman from the Florida Climate Institute and Miss Kimberly Vandeman from the Center for Environmental Studies. Welcome, ladies. And from our own School of Architecture, we have our Director of Academic Service, the Associate Director of Academic Services, Ms. Danai Morales. Where is she? Up front here, you can stand. I have to thank her and also the undergrad students here at the School of Architecture that prepared those information kits that you will be finding at your locations when you go back to your work areas. And finally, I want to thank my colleague at the Center for Urban and Community Design, our Assistant Director, as well as my faculty peer, Mr. Ricardo Lopez. I think I got everyone on my list. I would like to ask all the school teachers that are here to please rise for one moment so that we can recognize them as well. Thank you. And I want to ask the School of Architecture students who will be leading this charrette, they are the Resiliency Summer Studio students, to please rise at this moment. Yes. So, in case you're wondering, this is how it's going to work. These students that just got up right now have been instructed on how to pace the charrette. The idea that HUD had and that our dean had was that you as students would brainstorm together. The rest of us as adults that are here in the room, we are here to support you, to guide you, to see if you're spending too much time on one topic, to nudge you to move on. But the idea is that they will take you through a process called SWOT. If you haven't ever heard about what the SWOT process is, you will spend about 45 minutes time discussing what are the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats in your community. Once you've done that, and they will show you how that will happen with flip charts and post-it notes, it's meant to be a very quick process. We will be able to identify where the priorities lie in each group. And then from there, we will have about an hour or 20 minutes to come up with the envisioning process. At 12 o'clock, you need to be in the hall that is across from us. And you will notice that there are signs on the walls that tell you where you should place your different drawings. Okay? Box lunches will be in there as well. We ask you not to grab those until after you've already pinned up your drawings. Okay? We are going to ask you to work very efficiently as teams. The idea is that this is an opportunity for you to tell us what you think would be best for the host neighborhood for your school, okay? The Hialeah team, are you here? Where are you? Can I see you guys stand up? Where's my Hialeah team? All right, half of us. Okay, so you guys, we're so happy to have you with us, but you are a very large group. So we've got one room dedicated just to you, and it will be across the way. Who is the Hialeah group of SOA students? Please stand. Okay, this group of ladies will and gentlemen will be outside. Please follow them as soon as we're done here. They will lead you over to the Charrette room. You will see that that room has been set up into 5 different stations. Each one of them will be working with a different group in that room. And the faculty will be floating around, as well as the teacher will be floating around the different stations, okay? The other groups are in the hall that is right across from us, okay? And if you've already been in there, you've seen where you are. You are to go immediately to your station. I want to see, where is my masked SOA student? Catherine and Rhonda, please stand up, and Dan and Donnie. Okay, these are the 3 students that are going to be working with the masked group. Who is my Coral Park? Is that you? Azrar, please. Both of you stand up, Yaping. These 2 ladies are going to be working with the Coral Park group. Where's my biotech? Chloe, everyone, that will be your contact person to look for in the room. And finally, Alapata, Evelyn, Jessica, and thank you. You are all going to be looking for them. And I forgot Homestead. So where's our Homestead? Madeline, I know that's you. Madeline is here, and our Homestead group will be looking for her in the room, okay? We are immediately breaking unless there are any questions, or if any of my colleagues would like to make any comments before we break.
I just want to say one thing. Don't be shy about being engaged. That's where the fun part comes in, all right? Don't be shy about being loud. It's okay to be loud. Charrettes are meant to be loud. You got to be able to live with one another with lots of conversation going on around you. Don't be, and when you pin up ideas on the board, don't be constrained by what you think may or may not work. If you have the idea, put it up on the board. You'll work with it and you'll work through it, right?
Exactly. Remember that this is considered your first feedback loop. Each of you as groups will be going back to your schools and developing your projects further and preparing it for your second feedback loop, which will happen at the June 13th event, okay? So this is really meant to be the moment where you're thinking very creatively about solutions, all right? One last thing before we break. I'm going to ask that the faculty member work with the SOA student in charge for their group at all times through the process. And I'm going to ask them to, early on in the process, make the selection of a student from their group, because it will be one student from each group that will present your project ideas to everyone when we get together at the 12:15 mark. So all drawings up at 12 o'clock so that we can promptly get started at 12:15 with the presentations. Are we all good? We get what our marching orders? Thank you very much. We look forward to working with you the rest of the morning.